Your ID expired in 1990, sir. The mocking laughter rang out from the security guards as they looked at him with disdain. This looks like it was just pulled out of some old junk pile, one of them sneered. Can you believe they dismissed a true hero so easily? But Elijah Monroe, a veteran with eyes that had seen time pass, remained silent, offering no protest. He didn't rush to leave. Instead, he walked slowly, each step filled with quiet dignity. Could he really be the man they dismissed, or someone with forgotten sacrifices? This story will make you rethink how we judge others as the truth is revealed when least expected. Welcome to Graceful Valor Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. It was early on a crisp November morning, one of those rare moments when the air felt just a little too sharp, a little too heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the gates of Fort Redfield, the small military base nestled deep in the heart of the Midwest. The base had been a quiet one for as long as most of the soldiers there could remember, an outpost for the few, the proud, and the forgotten. But this morning was different. It was Veterans Day. The usual hum of morning routines was muted, the air thick with reverence. Kevin Matthews, a young soldier stationed at Fort Redfield, stood at the gate checkpoint. He had just been posted here a few months ago, and while he had grown used to the steady rhythm of military life, this day he felt was going to be different. There was something about the way the light hit the fences, something about the quiet murmurs of anticipation from the other soldiers that told him something important was about to happen. Kevin's mind wandered back to the last time he'd stood in formation for this day, his first year in service, when he thought it was all about the speeches, the flags, and the parades. But there was a different feeling in the air today, something he couldn't put his finger on. As he stood there scanning the horizon, he saw him. Elijah Monroe, an old man no older than 82, made his way toward the gate. Kevin's gaze flickered over him, but only for a moment. He wasn't the kind of man you noticed at first glance. A faded brown fedora sat low on his head, casting a shadow over deeply set eyes that had seen far more than most would care to know. His face, worn with age, looked like it had lived through decades of stories too heavy to share. Elijah was dressed simply: clean khakis, polished loafers, and a wool jacket that looked like it had seen better days, but was worn with quiet pride. His hands, though weathered and shaking slightly from age, gripped a cane in one hand, and in the other a thin envelope that seemed important, as though it carried the weight of years, memories, and stories he had never shared. Kevin took in the sight of this old man, and for a split second, he felt something stir inside him. Maybe it was the way the old man walked, slow but deliberate, like each step was measured, like each motion had purpose. Or maybe it was the way he held his cane, not as a crutch, but as something steady. Whatever it was, Kevin couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to this man than just his age. As Elijah approached the gate, Kevin stood at attention, as he had been trained to do, expecting the usual casual greeting or exchange, but instead, he watched as Elijah walked right up to the security booth, unhurried, with no sign of hesitation. There was nothing in his gait that screamed for attention, but there was something undeniably commanding in the quiet dignity he carried. It was the kind of presence that made everyone around him take a step back, even if only for a second. When Lieutenant Noah Rusk, the 28-year-old officer stationed at the checkpoint, saw the old man walking toward him, he was immediately dismissive. He was young, cocky, and had already formed an opinion about what this man might be. The ID in his hand was clearly old, so old that it had expired back in 1990. Rusk barely glanced at it, waving it off as if it were some old piece of paper not worth his time. With a smirk, he made a joke about the old man's ID, showing it off to the other guards around the booth, trying to impress them with his wit. Sir, if you're still a sir, you can't just walk onto a base with something like this. Rusk scoffed. This thing looks like it came out of a cereal box. This ID expired over 30 years ago. He laughed clearly, proud of his own joke, making sure the other guards heard. The other guards snickered, sharing in Rusk's amusement. One of them, Sergeant Kylie Baines, leaned back in her chair, sipping her coffee and watching the scene unfold. Let me guess, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Another decorated vet with a good story and a badge from the Reagan years. They all laughed, but through it all, Elijah said nothing. He didn't react to the laughter, didn't try to argue. His eyes remained calm, distant, almost as if he had heard worse in his time, but was still unshaken by it. Instead of engaging with the young lieutenant, he simply extended his hand to take his ID back, his fingers brushing against the thin envelope under his arm. Rusk handed the ID back dismissively, still laughing. Sorry, old-timer, but no valid ID, no entry. Try the museum down the road. He waved Elijah off, his tone laced with mockery. Elijah nodded once, his movement slow but deliberate. He turned without a word and began walking back toward the parking lot, his cane tapping against the ground with every step. His back was straight, his head held high as though nothing had happened. There was no anger, no argument, just an air of quiet dignity that seemed to hang around him like a cloak. Kevin Matthews watched the silent exchange, his mind buzzing with confusion. Something didn't sit right with him. He had been in the military long enough to know that when a man carried himself like that, there was more to his story than a piece of expired ID. As Elijah walked away, a silence seemed to fall over the base. It was as if the laughter that had filled the air just moments ago had been swallowed whole. Kevin felt the weight of that silence, heavy and unexplainable, and for the first time that morning, he began to wonder who was this man who had walked so calmly through the gate, not demanding attention, but quietly commanding respect in a way that only those who had lived through real battles could. What hidden legacy did this man carry? Find out on Graceful Valor Stories. Elijah Monroe didn't need anyone to notice him, he didn't need recognition, his dignity was his own, and it had been earned through decades of service, both on the battlefield and in the silence of the everyday. But as Kevin Matthews watched him sit on the bench beneath the tree, his cane resting by his side and his eyes fixed forward, Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. Something about Elijah felt like unfinished business, something that was about to come to light in a way no one could have predicted. The morning passed slowly, but Kevin kept his eyes on the old man under the tree, lost in thought, and as the base continued with its usual routine, Kevin felt an undeniable pull toward this quiet figure, a figure who seemed like he had walked out of another time, carrying the weight of history with him. What had Elijah seen in his life? What battles had he fought that no one ever spoke about, and why did the world, even those who served beside him, forget that honor is never in the medals you wear or the records you keep, but in the quiet moments when no one is watching? Kevin didn't know the answers yet, but he knew he would, and so, the story of Elijah Monroe, the man who carried his service quietly and with dignity, was just beginning to unfold. The morning sun had risen higher, casting a soft golden hue across Fort Redfield as the usual hum of military life began to return. Soldiers moved through the base in their usual routines, the distinct rhythm of boots on pavement marking the passing of time. But for Kevin Matthews, a new sense of unease lingered in the air. It wasn't the usual rush of morning drills or the sound of drills being executed in perfect sync. It was the quiet, the palpable sense that something had shifted. For the first time in weeks, Kevin found himself distracted. His thoughts kept drifting back to Elijah Monroe, the old man who had walked away from the gates without so much as a word, leaving behind a silence that gnawed at him. The memory of the old man's steady composure, the way he had walked off without demanding anything, stuck with Kevin. It had been almost an hour since the incident, but the laughter and mockery from earlier still echoed in his ears. He had never seen anything quite like it. The disrespect, the ease with which the guards had dismissed the old man. Kevin knew that something wasn't right. He had been in the military long enough to recognize authority when he saw it. And Elijah Monroe's quiet dignity had commanded something that no young officer like Lieutenant Mason Rusk could understand. As Kevin sat on a bench near the security booth, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the jokes or the mockery that bothered him, it was the certainty that no one seemed to care enough to find out who the old man really was. And if that was true, then how many others had been dismissed in the same way? How many veterans like Elijah had been brushed aside in favor of the flashy new recruits or the more easily understood heroes? The thought gnawed at him. Kevin glanced over toward the break room where the guards had gathered to talk, probably replaying the events from the gate. Private Elio Torres was standing off to the side, his arms folded, watching the others with an expression that Kevin couldn't quite place. He hadn't laughed, he hadn't joined in the jokes or mockery, and there was something about his demeanor that suggested he had seen something the others hadn't. Kevin's curiosity got the better of him. He stood up, taking a slow walk toward Torres, trying to make sense of what he was feeling. As he approached, he caught the tail end of a conversation. "You don't think that was the guy, do you?" Torres asked quietly. Lieutenant Rusk was still in his usual cocky mood, clearly oblivious to the shift in the air. "What, the old man?" "Nah, not a chance." Torres didn't look convinced. "I don't know, something doesn't sit right with me about it." He glanced over at the door of the security booth as if checking for someone. "You see something about that guy? Something feels too right, you know." Rusk shrugged and laughed again as if dismissing Torres's concerns, but Torres, standing at the edge of the group, remained silent, his gaze distant. Kevin stopped in front of him. "Torres, you okay?" he asked, trying to break through the fog of discomfort that seemed to hang over the younger soldier. Torres looked up at him, his eyes narrowed for a moment. It seemed like he was deciding whether or not to share what was on his mind. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know." He shifted on his feet, still watching the door. "I've seen something in him, I just can't shake it. You know, my grandfather, he fought in Korea. He never talked about it, but every now and then his voice would change when he did. You could hear the weight of it, you could feel the years." Kevin stood still, letting Torres's words sink in. "So, you think this guy's the real deal?" Torres nodded, his gaze never leaving the door. "Yeah, he's not just some old man with a story to tell. I think he's one of those guys who carries something no one ever asked for, and maybe no one even sees it." Kevin frowned. Something about Torres's conviction made him hesitate. Maybe it was the way he had spoken about his grandfather, the reverence in his voice, the way he described the quiet weight of Someone who had lived through things most people couldn't even imagine. As Kevin stood there, he couldn't help but wonder, what if Torres was right? What if this was someone who had seen things, done things that made him more than just the old man they had turned away? What if this wasn't the first time someone like Elijah Monroe had been overlooked? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp beep from Torres's phone. The young soldier glanced down at it before his face went pale. "What is it?" Kevin asked, sensing something had changed. Torres handed him the phone and Kevin's eyes scanned the screen, which displayed a message from someone named Jordan. The message read, "Run a check on Elijah Monroe, trust me, you need to know." Kevin frowned. He handed the phone back to Torres, who had already dialed another number. Kevin watched as Torres muttered a few words into the phone. His brow furrowed in concentration. The energy in the security booth shifted. It was like someone had flicked a switch, and everything had changed. The laughter, the mockery gone. Everyone seemed to feel it, but no one spoke about it. There was an odd tension now, one that seemed to hang in the air, thick and palpable. "What the hell's going on?" Lieutenant Rusk demanded, snapping at the group. Torres didn't answer. He was too busy with his phone, his attention fixed firmly on whatever was unfolding. Minutes later, a voice came through the phone. Torres nodded, listening carefully. "Yes, sir, got it." He hung up, his eyes now more serious than ever. "I need to go find him." Kevin turned, following his lead as they stepped out of the booth. It was then that something truly unexpected happened. A black SUV rolled into the parking lot, its presence undeniable. It wasn't the usual military vehicle. The tinted windows, the sharp look of the vehicle, all suggested it was something much more serious than a standard checkup or routine visit. Torres stepped forward, scanning the vehicle as it came to a stop. From inside, a tall figure in uniform stepped out, walking with the kind of authority that made even the airfield different. The man wearing the sharp uniform of a high-ranking officer scanned the area with military precision. He had the look of someone who had seen it all. "Where is Sergeant Major Monroe?" he asked, his voice strong but controlled. Kevin's heart skipped a beat as he heard the words. The name rang in his ears like a thunderclap, but it wasn't until the officer said it again, this time more urgently, that Kevin understood. Sergeant Major Monroe. Rusk, who had been standing there, clearly uneasy, pointed toward the bench where Elijah had been sitting just moments before. He still hadn't moved, still sitting with his cane in hand, his old hat resting gently on his lap. "That's him?" Rusk's voice trailing off in disbelief. The officer, whose name Kevin hadn't yet caught, nodded once, his gaze hardening as he looked at the old man. "Yes, that's him." And just like that, the story of Elijah Monroe, the quiet unseen veteran, was about to be rewritten. What shocking truth will change everything? Keep watching on Graceful Valor Stories. The world seemed to slow down as Colonel Isaac Greer stepped forward, his boots making a sharp, deliberate sound on the gravel of the parking lot. He was a man who carried authority effortlessly, the years of military service etched into his every move. Kevin Matthews could see the weight of that authority, but it wasn't just the uniform that made him stand out, it was the way he looked at Elijah Monroe. For a brief moment, there was a silence that held the air thicker than the fog that was beginning to roll in, the kind of silence that happens when something important is about to unfold, and everyone instinctively knows it. Lieutenant Rusk had been grinning only minutes before, but now he looked like someone who had just been struck by an overwhelming realization. Elijah Monroe hadn't moved since the SUV pulled up, still sitting in the same place under the tree, his brown fedora resting on his lap like it had all those years ago when he'd first worn it. His cane was steady in his hands, the polished wood gleaming in the soft light of the early morning. His gaze was forward, calm as though he were waiting for something, not for attention, but for recognition. Rusk watched the old man, his lips pressed together tightly, his eyes scanning every small detail about the man in front of him. Elijah was not the frail, unremarkable figure he had once assumed. There was something about him that stood apart, something in his stillness that demanded respect, something that had been completely overlooked earlier. At the gate, "Where is Sergeant Major Monroe?" the colonel asked again, his voice filled with command, but not with the usual formality. It was something more, a request for acknowledgement that went beyond mere duty. Rusk pointed toward the bench where Elijah had remained, the same bench where the old man had sat quietly waiting, just as he had so many years before. "That's him, sir." The colonel's gaze followed Rusk's finger, and the moment his eyes locked onto Elijah, there was a subtle shift in the air. The seriousness in Greer's face deepened. He moved toward the bench, each step measured and purposeful, his attention never wavering from the man who sat there, untouched by the hustle of the base that surrounded him. The others in the security booth, Private Elio Torres, still standing off to the side, and Sergeant Kylie Baines watched in silence, their faces reflecting the weight of the situation. No one spoke. The words that had been exchanged just moments ago about the old man, the mockery, the jokes, none of it seemed to matter now. It was as if the presence of Colonel Isaac Greer had wiped away all previous assumptions, and with it the ignorance that had clouded the truth. Elijah Monroe had been dismissed, ridiculed, and ignored, but now, with each step the colonel took toward him, the old man was being seen for the first time. As the colonel reached him, Elijah slowly stood, his cane tapping gently on the ground as he rose to meet the officer. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it carried with it the weight of someone who had done this many times before. There was no hesitation, no unease, only quiet dignity. The Colonel Greer saluted, his hand snapping up to his brow with the sharpness of a lifetime of military service. Elijah returned the salute with the same precision, the same reverence. Two men, one old, one younger, bound by history in a way that no one else could comprehend. Sergeant Major Monroe, the Colonel began, his voice calm but filled with undeniable respect. It's been a long time. Elijah nodded once, his lips forming the smallest of smiles. It's good to be remembered. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying emotion, a deep current of gratitude for the recognition he had so long been denied. The Colonel's eyes softened, his face reflecting a complex mix of emotions. It was as though a veil had been lifted from the old man, revealing a legacy that had been hidden in plain sight. The truth of Elijah Monroe's life was now unfolding in front of him, and with it came a heavy sense of responsibility. We've been looking for you for years, Colonel Greer continued, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking not just to Elijah, but to the past that had remained silent for far too long. We didn't know where you went or how to find you. Elijah's gaze remained steady, and for a moment, he seemed lost in the memories of the past. I wasn't looking to be found, sir, he said it simply, without bitterness, just the calm acceptance of someone who had lived with the weight of the world and had learned to carry it in silence. For the first time, Lieutenant Rusk stepped forward, his hand shaking slightly as he extended it to the old man. Sergeant Major, I didn't know. Elijah looked at him for a long moment, his eyes scanning the young officer with the same patience he had extended to the world around him. Then, without a word, he shook Rusk's hand firmly, a quiet acknowledgement that no words could truly capture. The tension in the air broke, but only slightly. Private Torres took a step forward, and for the first time he spoke. Sir, do you mind if I ask you something? Torres asked, his voice quieter than usual, the earlier mockery replaced by something like curiosity. Elijah raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral but open. Go ahead, Private, what's your story, sir? Torres asked, his voice a little uncertain, as if unsure whether he should be asking at all. The question hung in the air for a moment before Elijah spoke, his voice calm but steady. I've lived a life, Private, a life I don't always talk about. He paused, the weight of his words carrying more than they seemed at first glance, but the short of it is that I've seen things that most people never will. I've carried men out of the fire, I've carried the weight of the lives that I couldn't save, and I've done it all quietly because that's what we do. We do the job and we move on. To Torres, still standing in front of him, didn't speak. Instead, he nodded slowly, the gravity of Elijah's words sinking in. The Colonel, still standing beside Elijah, placed a hand on his shoulder. This man led Operation Falcon Wing in 1972. He turned toward the small group of soldiers who had gathered, some of them still unsure of the significance of the moment. He's the reason that many of you are here today. The words sent a ripple through the small gathering, each soldier feeling the weight of what had been said. A quiet murmur spread through the ranks. Kevin Matthews, still standing nearby, couldn't help but feel the shift in the atmosphere. Elijah Monroe wasn't just an old man who had been dismissed, he was a hero who had spent his life in silence, honoring the fallen and carrying burdens that no one had ever asked him to bear. The ceremony began without fanfare, without the usual speeches or distractions. Soldiers lined up in formation as Sergeant Major Monroe walked through them, his cane steady, his pace slow but unwavering. Behind him, Colonel Greer followed, walking with the same solemnity. It wasn't a parade, it wasn't a show, it was simply the recognition of a man who had been overlooked for far too long. As they reached the memorial wall, Elijah Monroe paused. He stood alone for a moment, his fingers tracing the names that had been carved into the stone. They were names that no one had spoken aloud in years, names of men who had followed him through the fire, men who had given everything. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah Monroe wasn't alone. As Elijah Monroe stood before the memorial wall, the weight of the moment settled in like a gentle tide washing over a shore. The stone beneath his fingers felt solid, unyielding, a reminder of the men who had been lost, men whose faces were now only memories etched in the fabric of time. The names carved into the wall were more than just markers, they were promises he had made long ago, promises to remember, to honor, to carry the weight of their sacrifice. Colonel Isaac Greer stood beside him, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to feel the gravity of the silence between them. The other soldiers, those who had followed the two men from the base, stood at attention, their eyes fixed forward, their boots snapping to attention as the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves seemed to echo through the courtyard. It was an odd thing, this silent ceremony, for in a world so accustomed to noise and fanfare, it was the quiet that held the most weight. There were no speeches, no declarations of valor, just the presence of a man who had lived through things no one would ever fully understand. Elijah Monroe didn't need words, he didn't need to be told that he was a hero. He had known that all along, even when no one else had. The air was still, and for a moment time seemed to hold its breath as Elijah continued to trace the names on the memorial wall. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, as though each letter carried the weight of the lives he had once held in his hands. As he reached the final name, his heart skipped a beat, and for the briefest of moments, his composure wavered. It was not a man he had saved, but a memory he had carried with him for all these years. "I came here for them," he murmured under his breath, not expecting anyone to hear, but the words somehow felt loud in the stillness. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, honoring those who had given everything, some with their lives, others with the pieces of themselves they had never been able to reclaim. Behind him, Colonel Greer stood with a quiet reverence, watching the old man with a respect that had only been earned through years of service, of sacrifice, and of unspoken leadership. The colonel's mind flickered back to the memories of his own service, of the men he had led, of the times he had witnessed the sacrifices of soldiers in ways that most people could never understand. Elijah Monroe wasn't just a man, he was a living testament to all that had been lost, to the price that had been paid so that the rest of the world could continue to live in peace. The silence continued to stretch, and as Elijah finally stepped back, his fingers brushing the final name on the wall, the crowd exhaled collectively. It was as though a deep sigh had been released, not in relief, but in recognition and understanding that this moment, this quiet pause in time, was more powerful than any grand gesture or speech could ever be. The procession that followed was simple, but it held a reverence that couldn't be faked. Soldiers, recruits, officers, all stood in perfect formation, saluting as Elijah Monroe walked past them. His movements were slow, his cane tapping lightly on the ground with each step, but there was a dignity in the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that resonated through the entire crowd. Lieutenant Rusk, who had once mocked the old man, now stood at attention, his jaw clenched tightly. His gaze was fixed ahead, but his thoughts were a chaotic mess. He had seen this man as nothing more than an old veteran, a relic of a past long forgotten, but now, standing here in the midst of this sacred moment, he saw him for what he truly was, a man who had led, who had sacrificed, and who had never asked for recognition. The reality of what had happened, though, the way Elijah had been dismissed and humiliated only hours before, sat like a weight in his chest. The man he had mocked, the man he had made a joke of, had now become the very definition of honor and dignity. Rusk swallowed hard, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to truly serve. As Elijah made his way toward the center of the courtyard, the crowd parted to make way for him. His steps were steady, but there was an aura around him now, something almost intangible. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't pride, it was something deeper, something that spoke of years spent carrying the weight of others' sacrifices without asking for anything in return. When Elijah reached the center of the courtyard, he paused. The crowd waited, their breaths held in anticipation. The air around them seemed to thicken as though the world itself was honoring the man before them. Colonel Greer stepped forward once again, his voice cutting through the silence. "This man," he began, his voice strong and clear, "is not just a veteran, he is a leader, a protector, a man who carried men when no one else could. His service does not end with his uniform, it continues in the way he lives, in the way he honors those who never made it home." The words hung in the air, and as Elijah stood there, his head slightly bowed in quiet acknowledgement, the crowd erupted in a slow, steady applause. It wasn't thunderous, it wasn't overwhelming, but it was real, it was genuine. It was the kind of applause that spoke of respect earned over a lifetime, of a man who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. For Lieutenant Rusk, the moment was a revelation. He had once seen Elijah as nothing more than a relic of a forgotten past, but now, as he stood in the midst of this solemn ceremony, he realized just how wrong he had been. The old man, the one he had mocked, was not a relic, he was a hero, and heroes, it seemed, didn't need recognition, they didn't need parades or medals, they just needed to be remembered. Private Torres, still standing at the back, watched in silence as the old man was finally given the recognition he had been denied for so long. There was a sense of pride that swelled in his chest, but it was a quiet kind of pride, the kind that comes from seeing something rightfully acknowledged after years of being overlooked. As the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd began to disperse, but the air was still thick with reverence. Elijah Monroe had walked through the crowd, unbothered by the attention, but the truth was clear. He had earned something far more valuable than applause. He had earned the kind of respect that can only be won through silent sacrifice, through quiet dignity, through a life lived for others. Colonel Greer stood off to the side, watching as the last of the recruits filed out of the courtyard. The weight of the moment was heavy, but it was also filled with a strange sense of peace. They had finally seen Elijah Monroe for who he truly was, and as the sun began to set over Fort Grantham, Elijah took one last look at the memorial wall, his fingers brushing the names once more, the names of those who had fallen, those he had carried, and those he would never forget. The base was quiet now, but the reverberations of what had transpired would echo for years to come. The fog settled over Fort Grantham like a heavy blanket that morning. The first rays of sunlight struggled to break through, casting long, ghostly shadows across the base. For the first time in a long while, there was a strange stillness in the air, as though the very ground was holding its breath, waiting for something profound to unfold. The events of the previous day had shaken the base to its core. Sergeant Major Elijah Monroe, once dismissed as a forgotten relic of the past, had been given a recognition long overdue. The soldiers, the officers, the recruits, they had all stood at attention, saluting not just a man, but a symbol of what honor truly meant. As the morning progressed, word of the ceremony spread like wildfire. The once dismissive laughter at the old veteran's expense had quickly turned to admiration, even to regret. Lieutenant Mason Rusk, who had once mocked Elijah for his old military ID, now walked through the halls of the base with his head held lower, his uniform impeccably pressed, but his posture not as confident as before. The man he had ridiculed had taught him more in one day than he had learned in years of service. In the heart of the base, Colonel Isaac Greer watched the young men and women as they marched into formation. His mind was still on Elijah, the quiet hero who had never sought praise, but had earned it nonetheless. He had seen many soldiers pass through his command, but none had left a mark as profound as Elijah Monroe. The colonel had never imagined that a simple act of courtesy, a humble gesture of respect, could have such a lasting impact, but there it was, Elijah's legacy woven into the fabric of the military community, now forever part of the story of Fort Grantham. The following day, as the base continued its usual rhythms, a small gathering took place in one of the officers' mess halls. It was an impromptu meeting, a reflection of what had transpired the day before. Sergeant Baines, who had watched the entire ceremony with a mixture of confusion and respect, sat at the table with Private Olio Torres, the young man who had first noticed Elijah and had set the wheels of recognition in motion. "Do you think it's enough?" Torres asked, his voice quiet as he sipped his coffee. He wasn't looking for praise or answers, just a reflection of what had happened. Baines looked at him, his face thoughtful. "What do you mean? Do I think it's enough that Elijah Monroe got the recognition he deserved? Hell, it's long overdue, yeah." But Torres hesitated, searching for the right words. "I mean, it's one thing to honor a guy like that for his service, but what happens now? How do we make sure it's not just some momentary applause? How do we keep honoring him, really?" Baines paused, his hands around his coffee cup, his gaze turning inward. Torres had a point. The applause had been real, the recognition had been genuine, but what about tomorrow? What about the soldiers who would come after, the ones who wouldn't have Elijah's story to hear? "It's not about the ceremony," Baines finally said, his voice firm. "It's about how we carry what he showed us forward. It's about keeping his kind of honor alive. I think that's the real legacy." As the days passed, Elijah Monroe continued to visit Fort Grantham every Veterans Day. It became a tradition, a quiet ritual that the base came to anticipate with reverence. There were no grand speeches, no public celebrations, just Elijah walking through the gates with his brown fedora in hand, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement as if each step was a small act of remembrance. In the years that followed, the story of Elijah became a touchstone for the base. New recruits, fresh out of training, would hear his name whispered in the halls. They would hear about the ceremony, the quiet man who had saved so many lives in the shadows of war, and the military honors that came too late, but were nevertheless earned. The more they learned about him, the more they understood that true honor wasn't something you could put on a uniform. It was something you earned every day with every action, every choice you made. And for those who had witnessed Elijah's transformation from a man dismissed by some to a hero recognized by all, the lessons of his life became ingrained in the way they led and the way they carried themselves in the world. Lieutenant Rusk, who had once laughed at the old man's outdated ID, now sought out Elijah every year, listening attentively as Elijah told his stories. He never demanded anything from the younger man, never asked for admiration, but Rusk had learned to respect him, truly respect him in a way he never thought possible. One afternoon, as Elijah sat at his favorite bench near the memorial wall, a young recruit approached him. The recruit was nervous, unsure of how to address the man who had become the living embodiment of everything they had been taught about duty and sacrifice. "Sergeant Major Monroe," the recruit asked hesitantly. Elijah looked up, his eyes steady, but with a kindness that put the young man at ease. "Yes, son, and I just wanted to say thank you," the recruit said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever measure up to what you did, but I hope I can honor it in my own way." Elijah smiled gently, his gaze never leaving the recruit's face. "Son, it's not about measuring up to anyone, it's about what you do every day. Just do your job, be true to yourself, and the rest will follow." The recruit nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. It wasn't often that he had the chance to speak with someone like Elijah Monroe, but he would carry the conversation with him, just as so many others did. As the years rolled on, Elijah's visits to Fort Grantham became a familiar part of life, a tradition that no one wanted to break. It wasn't about ceremony anymore, it was about continuity, about maintaining the thread of history and honor that had been woven so carefully over the years. Elijah didn't ask for anything, but he had become an integral part of the fabric of the base, a man whose quiet strength and unyielding commitment to those he had lost continued to inspire generation after generation of soldiers. And then one day, after his 89th birthday, Elijah Monroe didn't show up for his customary visit. The gates of Fort Grantham were quieter than usual, the absence of the old man felt by everyone who had come to rely on his presence, his stoic silence, and his reverence for the fallen. When the news came that Elijah had passed away quietly in his sleep, it was a somber moment for the base. There were no parades, no loud celebrations, just a quiet acknowledgement of a life well lived. Elijah Monroe had never asked for recognition, but in the end, he had received the greatest honor anyone could ever hope for: the respect of those who knew the value of service, the weight of sacrifice, and the depth of quiet heroism. In the years that followed Elijah's passing, the Elijah Monroe Gate stood proudly at Fort Grantham, a lasting testament to the quiet valor of a man who had once been overlooked, but whose legacy would never fade. The gate was a reminder to all who passed through it that honor was not something to be demanded, but something that lived in the quiet moments of sacrifice and service. And every Veterans Day, when the fog rolled over the base and the first rays of sunlight broke through the mist, the soldiers of Fort Grantham would stand at attention, saluting not just a name on a gate, but the man who had taught them that true honor never expires. It was a lesson that would live on, passed down from one generation of soldiers to the next as they carried the memory of Elijah Monroe with them. In the end, Elijah had left no headlines, no grand memorials, only a quiet legacy of dignity, of respect, and of a promise kept to the men who never made it home. His life had been his own, but his story belonged to everyone who believed in the power of honor, no matter how quietly it was earned. After the ceremony, the atmosphere at Fort Grantham remained quiet, but in the eyes of the soldiers and those who had witnessed the event, something had changed. They no longer saw just an old man, a soldier who had fought in the darkest chapters of history. They saw a reflection of perseverance and courage, a reflection not seeking recognition, but deserving of all respect. Elijah Monroe had lived through difficult days and fought in wars that many would never understand, but one thing was undeniable: he had always maintained his dignity. He was the soldier whose life had been written in invisible scars and losses that no one could measure, and now finally, he had received what he rightfully deserved: recognition not only from his comrades but from those who had once overlooked him. But justice does not come easily. While honors had been granted, Elijah Monroe knew that deep down many still did not truly understand his life, what he had sacrificed, and what he had lost. The price of this recognition, though perhaps not as valuable as medals or certificates, was something he had waited for so many years. After the ceremony, the footsteps echoed through the halls of Fort Grantham, not from the new recruits, but from the old soldiers who had followed Elijah on his journey. Each step, though silent, was full of meaning. Elijah returned to a small room in his modest house, not far from the base. The wooden door creaked as he opened it. Inside, everything was as it had been: the faded pictures on the walls, the old keepsakes, and the wooden desk where he had spent hours writing letters that had never been sent. Even though we can't turn back time, I will never forget you guys, he thought, glancing at the photo on the wall where he was in uniform, looking young. But today, everything felt different. There was a small joy in Elijah's heart today, a feeling that he hadn't experienced in a long time. Although what he had gone through couldn't be changed, today he felt the respect, something he thought he would never receive. That evening, after a simple meal, he sat before his old desk, opening the letters that had been kept for so many years. Each letter worn, each word was a memory, a farewell, a thank you to the comrades he had lost. Even though we can't come back, I won't ever forget you, he whispered, his eyes glistening with unspoken memories. A knock on the door broke the silence. Elijah slowly made his way to the door. Standing outside was Michael, his only grandson. Michael was smiling brightly, holding a small box. I have a gift for you, Grandpa, Michael said, his voice gentle but warm. Elijah looked at the small box and smiled. You didn't have to do this, Michael. Michael simply smiled and placed the box in his hands. I think you'll like it, Grandpa. When Elijah opened the box, inside was an old medal, one that he had received during his years of service. It was the same medal that he had kept in a special box, a gift from the base, but never displayed publicly. I think you'll like this, Michael said. You're my hero. Elijah stared at the medal. His heart stirred. He didn't need recognition from others, but from Michael, his grandson, it was enough. Thank you, son, he whispered, his eyes a little misty. The next day, as the sun rose, Elijah followed his usual routine, stepping out of the house and looking toward Fort Grantham. Though no longer a soldier of the past, he still felt a connection to the place where he had spent his life serving. But today, he was not alone. Michael had come with him, hand in hand, walking toward the light of a new day. Michael's gaze was filled with pride, not because he was his grandson, but because he saw him as a hero, someone he admired. They walked down the path leading to the base where Elijah's memory still lived. With every step, with every breath, there was a story, a history. The soldiers of the past had become heroes in their eyes, and the stories of sacrifice, perseverance, and camaraderie would live on. Despite everything that had happened, Elijah Monroe had finally found the recognition he deserved, and above all, he knew that no one could ever judge that soldier based on an outdated ID. Justice had arrived late. But it had arrived, and for Elijah Monroe, that was all he needed. That evening, when he finished his simple meal, he sat before his desk and opened the old letters that he had kept for so many years. Every letter worn, every word was a memory, a goodbye, a thank you to those comrades he had lost. Even though we can't go back, I will never forget you, he whispered. Glancing at the photo of himself in uniform on the wall, Michael's visit had brought more than just a gift, it brought a sense of belonging, of being remembered that Elijah had been deprived of for so long. His legacy, even without the medals and official recognition, would live on in the hearts of those he had impacted, especially his grandson. As they stood together under the dimming evening sky, Elijah knew his story wasn't over yet. He still had time to share it, to pass on the lessons he had learned. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Elijah stood at the same old spot, looking out at the base. He wasn't just a man who had served in the military, he was a man who had lived through it all, and he would continue to live on in the stories of others, even if the world had forgotten him for a time. He took a deep breath, his hand resting on his cane. It had been a long road to this moment, but Elijah knew one thing: even when no one else was watching, he had done the right thing, and now the world was starting to understand that in our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition, some just need to know that today someone isn't going hungry, and sometimes that alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.